The UK government took the unusual step today of directly condemning Russia for a cyber attack, publicly blaming the Russian government for spreading a virus which swept across Europe last June. The so-called NotPetya attack hit companies, including British ones, after initially targeting Ukraine. This unprecedented public accusation against the Kremlin by the government also includes the threat of imposing costs on those who would seek to do us harm. You'll remember that this follows last month's irregular and apparently unsanctioned statement by the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson that a Russian cyber attack could cause thousands and thousands of deaths by crippling energy supplies. Well, tomorrow the annual International Security Conference opens in Munich, a conference that Theresa May will be addressing, where the Kremlin will be on the radar. So is Russian cyber warfare now a clear and present danger to us? Here's our technology editor, David Grossman.
Conflict on Russia's doorstep. The war in Ukraine is brutal, but on the surface, familiar. However, Russia is doing battle using other means.
Ukraine and Russia are obviously in a situation that can only be described as war and open conflict. And the digital attacks, cyber attack component plays a major role. We've seen the boundary attacking the electric grid in Ukraine. We've seen several major attacks there. We've seen high-powered pieces of attack tools that haven't been tested anywhere else. The concern is that Ukraine is a test bed for cyber attacks that will be deployed and could be deployed against Western, European and American targets later on.
And that is the worry that keeps Western generals up at night. NATO defence ministers were in Brussels today for a summit, trying to deal with a world where the line between war and peace is so blurred, partly because attacks are deniable. The UK Defence Minister, Gavin Williamson, though, today explicitly accused the Russian government of waging cyber war on the West.
It's no longer about the warfare that will fight just on land, sea and air, but increasingly it will also be cyber and space as well. So NATO has to adapt.
This raid by Ukraine's cybercrime unit on a computer company last summer was an attempt to shut down a malware virus called NotPetya. The company was an unwitting host, but the virus spread around its clients, shutting down businesses all over Europe, including in the UK. And it was this attack that the UK has now specifically blamed Russia for.
It was an attack that destroyed data on 10% of all of Ukraine's computers. Ukraine is a country of 40 million people. 10% of all its computers were damaged. The attack spread extremely quickly globally, probably cost the world economy something on the order of beyond 1 billion with a B pounds. It was so bad, just to make it real for people, it affected the production of Durex condoms for 2 weeks. It affected shipments of Oreo cookies. It nearly brought down worldwide shipping. It was an extraordinary attack.
At the time, many suspected Russia, but for the government to publicly accuse them of mounting the NotPetya attack is, according to observers, a significant development.
It seems like some sort of statement is being made by the government about this. If you look at the CIA made a similar statement in January, and in fact the Ukrainian government at the time of the attack made a similar statement.
It's one thing to identify Russia as a cyber aggressor, it's something else to do anything about it. Indeed, it's not clear what the purpose of today's announcement was, other than to set the scene ahead of today's NATO meeting in Brussels, to send a strong message to Russia. However, there have been many such messages in recent months to no obvious effect.
The problem with trying to answer this type of threat is it's not just about protecting computers and networks. The damage is often felt in a country's morale.
Over the past 10 years, we've seen an evolution of cyber attacks that cause sometimes only minor harm, but are really executed for political effect, because these types of attacks tend to get a very significant amount of press coverage and therefore have, if you like, have a bit of have a bit of a terrorizing effect. So it's a very effective psychological tool. It's almost psychological warfare what we're looking at here.
The ease with which a government can use computers to strike its adversaries without warning or reckoning makes the world a more tense place. Russia responded to the UK government's accusation with a predictable denial. The supposedly strong message has been sent and apparently ignored.
David Grossman there. Well, we did ask to speak to the Russian government. They didn't give us anyone to interview, but the Russian embassy did say that there was no evidence that they held any responsibility for the NotPetya cyber attack. Now, the accusations made by the British government were part of a continuing campaign aimed at the stigmatisation of Russia. We also asked the British government onto the programme, but they declined to. But indeed, joining me now is Dmitry Linik, former head of Radio Russia's London bureau, Edward Lucas, the journalist and author of The New Cold War, Putin's Threat to Russia and the West, and from Munich, Laura Galanti, a cybersecurity expert and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council International Affairs think tank. Good evening to you all. If I could begin with you, Laura, does Russia have the capability to do a lot of cyber damage or a lot of minor harm?
We've seen Russia undertake a variety of different operations, from standard espionage conducted over cyber operations all the way up to critical infrastructure attacks, and then the most recent NotPetya attack, which focused on the financial sector and then had a lot of externalities, which we just covered. So Russia has taken an approach of ratcheting up the types of operations that they're willing to undertake in cyberspace, and they've had both a technical and a psychological component to them.
Right, well, let's talk about the technical component. What can they actually do? What damage can they actually do? Because you know about this stuff.
So let's take the Ukraine example of the power grid going down in 2015 and then again in 2016. With both of those operations, large parts of the country's power grid went down, and Black Energy, the malware behind this, was traced back to likely the Russian military. And what's been difficult to see in the West in terms of the capability that Russia has here is the lack of 100% certainty around how these tools are deployed. And what we're constantly faced with is this legalistic tendency that we naturally have in the West to want to say, here is the 100% level of factual evidence that leads to this. But cyber doesn't lend itself to that type of analysis. We can look at the evidence, who's likely to benefit from this, what sort of evidence in the malware, the tools is available to explain who's behind it, and then what was the effect that it achieved. And with the Ukrainian power grid attacks, the effect was both psychological in Ukraine and also a real warning shot to the West to say, critical infrastructure, this is something that will be targeted.
Well, thank you very much for that. Dmitry Linik, if it wasn't Russia, who was it?
I've no idea. I've no evidence to suggest that Russia didn't do it. Yep. Nobody can have that sort of evidence. But I would like, as Laura just said, evidence to support these very serious accusations.
But as Laura said, that in cyber warfare, that's harder to do. But in fact, the Black Energy malware was traced back to the Russian military.
Whether it was or it wasn't, that's debatable. I'm not a computer expert, but I've read views of computer experts who disagreed with that. And then, as Laura suggested, on the sort of balance of probabilities, is that how we lob accusations at Russia, at the Kremlin, at the country? I don't think that's a right way to go about it.
Do you think then that's the British government has been reckless itself then in making that public accusation today?
Absolutely. I think the British government in particular has been accusing Russia over the years of the most ridiculous things. Like Russia is a threat to NATO, a country that spends, 10% of the NATO budget.
Well, Edward Lucas, it plays into the idea that we do always think of Russia in a Cold War context and of a pariah and so forth. You know, but Dimitri's right, there isn't, and Laura says it, there isn't actual evidence. You're talking about balance of probability, are you?
Well, not in all cases, actually, no. For example, the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia, which crippled that country's infrastructure, and a senior official, Sergei Markov, actually admitted that it was guys in his office who had carried it out. Now, admittedly, it was quite a crude cyber attack. He was sort of boasting about it.
But it was a psychological intent as well.
And Putin has also made sort of wisecracks about the attack on the American political system, saying if it wasn't us, it was someone like us. So I think you have to be careful in saying it's always balance of probabilities.
But what is the benefit? I mean, the contributor in the film was saying even discussing it is the destabilizing thing that people want to actually set this off. What has Russia got to benefit from this? Is this flexing the muscles not only towards Ukraine but also to the West and to the UK?
Well, as Dimitri rightly pointed out, Russia's a lot weaker than the West when the West is united. The West has 7 times Russia's population, 14 times Russia's GDP. So Russia's main aim is to play divide and rule and use what in the jargon is called asymmetric weapons, weapons that a weak country can use quite successfully against a stronger one, and cyber is a classic example of that.
Well, Laura, on the psychological impact of this, why do you think Vladimir Putin would want to be being seen or even being talked about as the aggressor?
Putin has 2 goals here, and his primary audience is internal. It's domestic. He has to figure out how to keep popularity and keep his position. And part of that requires showing Russia's strength. If Russia can chip away at Western alliances, as Ed's referring to, if it can chip away at the sense that the West is the place where freedom of speech and freedom of press have created these liberal democracies that are a model, then Putin wins internally. And Putin is very aware that the end of the Soviet Union, in his mind, is based on the attraction of the West, and in his mind, the false attraction of the West. So the more he's able to chip away at what the West attracts from a Russian population, the more effective his operations will be in showing strength in Russia's ability to go toe-to-toe to the West, whether it's hintingly in the 2016 elections, though there's a lot of evidence, an overwhelming amount of evidence that it is the Russian military behind that in a group called APT-28. This is how Putin is able to show his people that Russia is 10 feet tall and able to project power on the national and international stage.
Dimitri, does it make you think well of Putin both domestically and abroad that he's being talked in these terms?
That's a very novel approach to the problem that I've just heard from Laura project. That's not the way it's played out in Russia. It's viewed in Russia. Actually, I think we're talking about a bigger problem. For more than 10 years, the West has been manufacturing an enemy out of Russia.
My point comes back to who else has it in? Who else has to gain from an attack on Ukraine? Tell me, is it the Chinese?
This is speculative, but it's those that undermine the two-way relationship between Europe and Russia, between the West and Russia.
Edward, let's, we're not talking about clean hands when it comes to America. Look at Stuxnet, look at the attack.
Yes.
If Russia's at the game, others are at the game, the Americans and indeed the Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, I think all countries engage in espionage, and certainly America ran a targeted attack on the Iranian nuclear program. Many people would say that was a much better way than trying to bomb Iran's nuclear program. But I think the point here is that Russia's cyber weapons are being deployed in a very reckless way. If Russia was simply spying the way the Chinese...
Is Gavin Williamson right, actually, that the damage could kill thousands if they attacked the energy system?
I suspect that's... clearly, if the power grid shut down in Britain, then there would be terrible disruption. Probably people would die. I actually think the American power grid is more vulnerable than the British one because it's less resilient. But I think the fundamental point here is that Russia is showing its muscles, and we don't really have an answer. We should have an answer, which would be seizing and freezing Russian money here.
Thank you all very much indeed.